Hi, the SI meteorologist Paul Dorian here. Well, it's that time of the year again, well into October, where we like to take a look ahead of the possibilities for the upcoming winter weather conditions here in the Mid-Atlantic region. Last year we had quite a snowy winter from the Mason-Dixon line up to points north and east. Philadelphia, for example, had way above normal snowfall. So did New York City and Boston. Meanwhile, down across the D.C. to Baltimore region, they were kind of in a snow hole last year that extended up into parts of central PA where they had lower than normal snow. Over the next few minutes, I'll talk about what I expect for the upcoming winter and the major factors involved in making that forecast. But before we get to that, let's take a look again at last year. And again, we had only 10 inches of snow recorded at Reagan National Airport in D.C., 14 inches at BWI, both of which were lower than the normals of 15 and 21 inches respectively. But once you got north of the Maryland-Pennsylvania border and on points to the north and east, you had quite a bit of snow, much more than normal. 44 inches in Philly, 62 inches at Central Park, and 81 inches recorded at Logan Airport in Boston. The interesting thing about Philadelphia, 2 years ago they recorded 78 inches in the snowiest winter ever. Last year was 44 inches. Philly has never had 3 straight winters with 40-plus inches of snow, so we'll monitor that over the next several months to see if we can break that barrier in Philadelphia, and I'll give my forecast in a few minutes. Well, there are quite a few factors that a meteorologist can look at to get some clues as far as what the upcoming winter weather conditions will be like here in the Mid-Atlantic region. I have listed here some of the major factors that I believe will play a role in our winter weather in 2011 to 2012. Namely, I believe we'll have a continuation of the negative PDO. This is a long-term cycle in the northern Pacific, and we have entered a cold phase. I believe that cold phase or negative PDO will continue right through the upcoming winter months. A shorter-term cycle in the tropical part of the Pacific that goes back and forth between El Nino and La Nina. I believe we will have La Nina, colder than normal temperatures in the Pacific over the next several months. It'll be a weak to moderate La Nina and an east-based La Nina. Meanwhile, the northern Atlantic has its own cycle, a short-term cycle that goes back and forth between positive and negative NAO. I believe that this negative NAO regime that we've had over the last few winters will dominate again this winter. It won't be entirely negative. We will obviously go back and forth between negative and positive at times during the winter, as this is really a short-term cycle. However, the negative NAO should dominate over the winter months. In terms of solar activity, we have, over the last several months, have come out of the historic solar minimum that occurred between the years of about 2004 to 2008. Historic in the sense that we had more spotless days on the sun in that solar minimum time period than at any time in about 100 years. We are now increasing the sunspot activity and the solar storms. However, I think we're just coming out of the solar minimum and still on the low end of things. And why is that important? Some studies have indicated that low solar activity tends to correlate to negative NAOs. So that's why that's an important factor to look at. By the way, on the Meteorology 101 section of our website here at the siweather.com, we have quite a detailed videos on a lot of these factors, including the PDO, La Nina, NAO, and, in fact, the solar activity, the solar storms, etc. Another factor to look at is what's going on in terms of the tropical Atlantic City. We're winding down now. It's not over yet, but we've had quite an active season in terms of number of named Atlantic storms. Why is that important? Again, research studies indicate that an active tropical Atlantic season tends to favor negative NAO regimes. Finally, I like to take a look at the current snow cover throughout the northern hemisphere, and we actually have more snow on the ground throughout the northern hemisphere than almost at any winter since 2002, and only about a handful of winters have had more snow at this time, this stage going into the winter season, than we currently have. Why is that important? Well, the cold air source for northern part of the U.S. extends from Canada to Alaska and across the poles into Siberia. And if the snow cover extent is quite large, that favors the development of some deep, long-lasting cold air masses, which, of course, in turn favors the generation of snow in the northern part of the U.S. Well, let's now take a look at some graphics and plots over the next few minutes to get a little bit more detail on a lot of these major factors that we just talked about. First of all, this is the latest sea surface temperature anomaly chart showing the Pacific Ocean colder than normal temperatures off the west coast of South America. This is the La Nina. It's colder than normal, and I believe it'll continue in a weak to moderate phase. The NOAA keeps a running index of the La Nina, and I believe we'll probably head towards a minus 0.5 to minus 1.0 during the winter months. That's weak to moderate. The coldest part of this La Nina is in the eastern regions of this particular tropical Pacific location, again favoring an east-based La Nina over the winter months. Meanwhile, across the northern Pacific, this is a classic signature of a negative PDO with warmer temperatures here and colder temperatures off the coast of Alaska and the western coast of the U.S. This negative PDO phase should continue right through the upcoming winter months. And why is that important? Well, this is more support for the belief that La Nina will continue through the winter months, because negative PDO tends to favor more frequent and longer lasting La Ninas. In fact, many negative PDO winters phases have featured back-to-back winters of a La Nina, and last year we had a strong La Nina, and again this year I believe indications are we'll continue to have La Nina, probably in the weak to moderate phase. Well, here's another way to look at the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Again, I believe we slipped into a negative PDO phase, a longer-term phase. Sometimes these last 2 or 3 decades, and you can see the last several years we've had negative PDO represented here by the blues. Now, another interesting fact here that I want to point out is the last long-term negative PDO phase was during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in a couple of minutes, I'll show some of the analog winters that I believe have a lot of similarity to this winter in terms of PDO and La Nina. And most of those winters fall in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the last time we had this negative PDO long-term phase. Well, another reason I believe we'll have a weak to moderate La Nina is kind of detailed on this particular plot here. This is a plot of a whole series of models that have been run during the month of September for the upcoming winter months and beyond in terms of the ENSO state. These models are predicting whether or not it should be a La Nina or an El Nino. And if you look here at the December, January, February time frame, we have a whole series of predictions by these models, and there are a few above the black line which represent El Nino, but most of them fall below the black line which represent La Nina predictions by these models. And if you average this out, this comes out to about a minus 0.4, which again is leaning me to believe that we'll have a roughly a minus 0.4 or all the way up to a minus 1.0 type of La Nina, a weak to moderate La Nina. Well, I've put together here a composite map of temperature anomalies based on what I believe are analog years, the years that have similar conditions to this year, namely a weak to moderate La Nina along with a negative PDO phase. And here is the handful of winters that I believe have quite a few similarities to this particular season. Again, many of them fall in the last negative PDO phase of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And if you look at those particular winters and what the temperatures were relative to normal, this is what occurred. We have a tendency for colder than normal from about the mid-Atlantic all the way up into the northeastern part of the U.S. in these particular analog years, much colder than normal across the north-central part of the country. Meanwhile, down in the south, there's a tendency to have a ridge in the southeastern part of the U.S. during La Nina winters, and this is what could happen with warmer than normal temperatures here in the southeastern part of the U.S. So another thing to focus in on here is the fact that there's a kind of a neutral zone here. This is going to set up, I believe, as a battle zone here. You have much colder than normal in the northern part of the U.S., much warmer than normal in the southern part of the U.S. This will lead to quite a baroclinic zone or a temperature gradient zone in this part of the country. And that tends to favor a storm track moving in this direction with west to east moving storms along this baroclinic zone or temperature gradient. And I believe that'll be the predominant type of storm track this year. Instead of storms coming out of the Gulf of Mexico and riding up the East Coast, although there will be some of those, I believe that will not be the dominant storm track. Rather, it will be a west to east moving type storm across the Ohio Valley that then moves off the mid-Atlantic coast and redevelops as it then moves up the eastern New England coast. So again, the battle zone here may favor a storm track cutting across the Ohio Valley towards the mid-Atlantic coast and then up the coast, rather than the full-blown East Coast storms that we've had quite a bit of over the last few years that ride up from the Gulf of Mexico up the East Coast. Well, let's focus in on the NAO, and again, we talked about the fact that I believe we're in a low solar activity period, also an active tropical Atlantic season. Those factors tend to correlate to negative NAO regimes. Also, we've fallen into a negative NAO regime over the last few years. You can see here by the blues here, and I believe that'll continue right through the upcoming winter months. Now, this is a short-term cycle in the North Atlantic. It doesn't mean we'll stay negative all winter. In fact, we will not. It'll vary from negative to positive, but the dominant phase will be a negative NAO. Why is that important? That tends to lead to a blocking pattern in the upper part of the atmosphere. Cold, high pressure generally sits over Greenland, and that in turn can push cold air into the northeastern part of the U.S., which of course favors the development of snow in the northeastern part of the U.S. Well, in terms of solar activity, this is a map of the monthly average sunspot cycles that goes way back in time, back to the 1700s. And again, here we are now. We're still on the low end. We are increasing, but I believe we're still on the low end of activity. And again, some studies suggest that low solar activity favors negative NAO. We're coming out of that solar minimum, headed towards a maximum in about 2013 or so. Well, here's the final map before I show the expectations for the winter season. Here we have the snow cover, the current snow cover, and the thing I want to point out here is the brown areas here represent snow cover, and this is quite different, quite a bit more expansive over Siberia compared to 1 year ago today, and 1 year ago today was leading into quite a snowy season. So again, the northern hemisphere has quite a bit of snow cover extent right now. In fact, only a handful of winter seasons or fall seasons have had more snow than we currently have. So this is a neutral to certainly a bullish signal for more cold and snow in the northern part of the U.S. for the upcoming winter. Well, what does all this mean? I put it all together here on this summary chart. Based on all those factors we just talked about, I believe we'll have above normal snowfall in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. However, it'll likely be less than last year considering the high amounts that those cities recorded last year. Meanwhile, normal to slightly above normal snowfall across the Washington and Baltimore regions, which would be more than last year considering how low their snow totals were for last year. Generally a cold winter from the mid-Atlantic up north and east, near normal to slightly below normal across DCA and Baltimore, increasingly colder than normal from Philadelphia to New York to Boston. Now, the analog years showed some interesting patterns in terms of temperatures. If you look at those analog years month by month, actually showed kind of a topsy-turvy pattern, so I would predict that for this year with a cold November, a warm December, followed by a cold January and February. So we'll go back and forth between cold and warm and cold, it looks like. Again, we talked about that storm track. I don't expect as many coastal storms that develop over the Gulf of Mexico and ride all the way up the East Coast. There will be a few, but not as many as recent winters. Rather, the predominant storm track may be with west to east moving storms across the Ohio Valley, across that huge temperature gradient in the middle part of the country. They will then tend to redevelop as they hit the mid-Atlantic coast and move northeast along the eastern part of New England. The threat for ice storms is somewhat heightened this year because of that storm track. The combination of an Ohio Valley storm, for example, and a negative NAO with cold air locked into place in the northeastern U.S. may favor more ice storms this year than we've had in the past few years. As you have cold air locked in, there may be some a tendency for some warming in the upper parts of the atmosphere given that expected storm track. Again, an early start to winter with a cold November, followed by perhaps an above normal December, but then back cold again for January and February. And here are some of the specifics. First of all, in terms of temperatures, near normal in D.C. and Baltimore, but increasingly colder than normal as you go from Philadelphia to Boston. Again, the snowier and colder relative to normal as one goes up the coast. And northern New England is in store for a very cold and snowy winter, I believe, places like Maine, northern Vermont, and northern New Hampshire. In terms of snowfall, near normal to above normal across D.C. and Baltimore, and even more above normal as you go from Philadelphia all the way up to Boston. These are the number of inches I expect in the cities themselves, but for this particular year, it should be more snow to the north and west of all the big cities. So 20 inches plus in the northern and western suburbs of D.C., all the way to 65 inches plus north and west of Boston. So it'll be hard to reach that 40-inch mark in Philadelphia, for example, but we should have above normal snowfall. So we'll update this over the next several weeks, but that's the winter forecast for now. I'm the SI meteorologist, Paul Dorian.